many of you may have noticed, that passage is not Ephesians. So I decided, because of time, I wanted to be able to make sure I had the time I needed for Ephesians, but also, since we're having communion this week, I wanted to do a little bit of a talk on communion and go from there, all right? So one of the things I want to talk about before I read the primary passage is the problems that Paul addressed in 1 Corinthians chapters 1 through 10. So as we get moving on this sermon, I wanted to bring out what the focus Paul had in his letter, because many of you may know that Paul was really reprimanding and correcting and doing a lot of things in 1 Corinthians for the 1 Corinthian church. And some of those things is that he was talking about the division in the church because they had a misunderstanding of the gospel, they had a misunderstanding of the messengers, and they had a misunderstanding of Paul specifically, okay? And so they were kind of, like, that's, 1 Corinthians is the one that says, I know Paul, I know Cephas, I know, he was saying, correctly, it's like we should all just be focused on the gospel. Okay, he also had to correct some sexual immorality in the church in 1 Corinthians. There's also poor management of disagreements, meaning church members were taking other church members to court, basically. Instead of trying to resolve it within the church body and do it that way, they were trying to get the world to take care of their disputes. Okay, and then Paul did some counseling on marriage, and he did some counseling on things offered to idols. And then he talked about, and we're going to tie into this where we pick up in 1 Corinthians 11, is mismanagement of worship services. Okay, so my theme today, my goal today is if you saw my sermon title, it's a celebration, not a party. Okay, and we're going to see that that's kind of what happened in the Corinthian churches. They turned it into a party. And some may think it's like, well, if it's a celebration, why isn't it a party? And so I just, since I'm fairly new here, I want to kind of just bring forth an idea this time around of the seriousness of communion. And I want to say it up front, this is not to scare you into not taking communion, okay? The focus is to get us to recognize the reverence that we should have for communion, okay? So if we start out, we're going to go through the passage. I'm not going to read the whole thing this time. I'm kind of going to go through it as we read it. It says, now, in giving these instructions, Paul gave them instructions, all these instructions, plus he's getting ready to give them the instructions on how to perform the Lord's Supper, communion. It says, I do not praise you, since you came together not for the better, but for the worse. Okay? So he's saying is, I'm not patting you on the back right now because you guys aren't doing it right? He says you come together not for the better of the church, not for unity, not for looking out for each of your fellow brethren and sisters. He says, but you're coming together for the worse. And why is that? He says, for first of all, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. Okay, because why? He says, in part, I believe he's saying, I've heard of these divisions. I've heard of you saying that one's of Paul, one's of a Cephas, and you got all this conflict going on because you're not in unity. And he goes, I can believe it. And he says, for there must also be factions among you, that those who are proved may be recognized among you. That's a mouthful. If you try to read it too fast like me, you stumble on your tongue. But the idea is that he's saying is there's preferential treatment going on in the church. If you had money, you were treated good. If you didn't have money, you weren't treated so good. That type of thing. It was that simple. They were not treating each other fairly. So Paul is addressing this. Okay, it says, therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat this Lord's Supper. This, therefore, is there for the prior passage. So Paul is still continuing on his reprimand of what they're doing. So he's saying when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. In other words, you're doing it. You're coming here thinking that's what you're doing, but that's not what's going on. He says, for in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others. Now, does that speak of Christ? Christ was a servant to all, right? And so he's saying that whoever can get in the line first is the one that's going up. It says, so what's happening is, because see, you got to remember, if you don't, I'll tell you, is that communion was a meal. Christ, that's why they called it the Last Supper. Okay, so there was this meal going on, and so each one was going and getting his own meal, and then one is hungry and another is drunk, and they're calling it that they're practicing the Lord's Supper, but then because of the disarray in which they're doing it, and nobody preferring one over another, is that one of them is hungry and the other one is drunk. Quite literally drunk in church, okay? It says what? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? And this is where Paul is starting to say, the Lord's Supper isn't just a party, a time to have a meal and see who can get the drunkest or who can end up dancing on the tables. That's not what he's saying that communion is. If you need a meal, that's why we have little bitty crackers and little bitty juice, right? We're not here to get filled up on food. We are here to get filled up on food, but not physical food, on spiritual food. So the focus always has to be that why are we here? He says it's so bad that he says, or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? So here they're having the Lord's Supper, they're partaking of communion, and one person's going hungry because he doesn't have enough, and another person is ending up drunk because they're having too much fun of this meal. It says, what do I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you. I like the King James Version that says, I praise you not. Okay? He's saying, I'm not about to pat you on the back for this. I'm not about to say anything of it is good. I'm not about to make you feel good about this. And he goes, I am not happy with what you're doing. You're abusing the privilege, okay? And so I'm going to skip the 23 through 26, which is the process for communion. We'll go over that when we have communion. So I want to continue on, drop down, because it ties in with the whole passage we've been covering. So therefore, after he gave the instructions, but also this there is for what I just covered, and it's also going to cover the communion passage that we'll read later. So that's why this there is there for, okay? He says, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. This is where the fire and brimstone people will condemn you if you have any sin in your life, okay? The idea is you need to remember by why you're taking communion. Nobody's perfect. None of us are perfect, okay? And so to think that you have to be perfect to take communion is not what Paul is saying here. He's saying that because they turned it into a party, because they weren't in unity, people were going hungry and people were in overabundance, he's saying that, that's not a worthy manner. You're forgetting the purpose of it. He says, but let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. So he's saying that this is what I like about this passage. Sometimes we don't stress this sentence enough. Okay? We like to really beat down and say, make sure you're doing this right, make sure you're doing it right, and we forget the purpose. But it says, but let a man examine himself. This is why communion is a thing in unity, because we're serving Christ, but it's also very personal because of your unity individually with Christ. So he's saying is let a man examine himself. We're not going to start saying you can, you can, you can, you can. We're not going to do that. You get to decide. You get to examine your own heart. Some people look at this differently. Some people that's why we shouldn't be judging people. That's why maybe you should pray more during communion, because if you're looking around to see who's taking and who's not, well, then you're judging, okay? And you're not judging yourself. You're judging the others. Because some people, in the way they take this so serious, that if they feel like they had a bad week, they have something, whatever, they may not partake, but it doesn't mean they're not a Christian. It doesn't mean that they're evil. It doesn't mean that they're a bad individual, right? It just means that it's Communion Sunday that we do on the first Sunday of the month, and that Sunday just didn't work out for them, okay? And so that's why we shouldn't be worrying about what everybody else is doing during communion. And that's what it says. So let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. Okay, so you examine yourself, and you can drink of the bread and eat of the bread and drink of the cup. He says, for he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. So in other words, if you're in a mindset of not taking it seriously, if you're in a mindset of not recognizing the import of what communion is, you are drinking judgment to yourself, okay? Not discerning the Lord's body, not recognize the purpose of communion, the purpose of the Last Supper is to remember who we have in Christ. Okay, and so when it says this, for this reason, even to the point where Paul's saying, for this reason, many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. Okay, he's saying people are dying because they're not respecting the Lord. I'm not going to start saying if somebody gets sick or somebody dies after Communion Sunday, I'm not going to be judgmental and say, well, they shouldn't have taken communion. It's not like that, because again, there's more things than this that will cause weakness or sickness and death, okay? There's more things than just taking communion unworthily, okay? It says, because it continues on, Paul continues on explaining it. It says, for if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged, okay? So again, examine yourself. We judge ourselves. We don't judge others. We will not be judged. But when we are judged, we are chastened by the Lord, that we may not be condemned with the world. Okay? So in other words, God's going to take care of it. If he knows our heart, we should be happy that we are not going to be condemned with the world, because we are saved, we are Christian. Maybe we have I just have such a hard time putting this into words, because again, I don't want to scare people from communion. We don't use fear tactics to do that. It misses the point. It misses the love factor. Okay? Because we should know that we're taking it in the right heart as best as we can, and we're not going to be, and we might be chastened by the Lord if we're unworthy or not. It's the fact is the second part, that we may not be condemned with the world, because we aren't. We're saved. We're Christians. If you believe as Christ died for you and you ask him into your heart and ask forgiveness for sins, we are not part of the condemned with the world. Okay? Therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. I didn't highlight that, but wait for one another. Again, preferring others, being the servant, allowing others. But if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home. Again, don't turn this into a meal. It's not to fill up physically, it's to fill up spiritually. Lest you come together for judgment, and the rest I will set in order when I come. Okay? And so, again, Paul has bracketed, and we're going to get to the communion part, and Paul is basically saying, you worry about where you're at with God, and you determine whether you should be taking communion or not, and don't worry about what the other person. I'll even say that. If you're worried about somebody else looking and seeing you take communion, they might think that you're unworthy. Let them, right? That's on their head. That's not on your head. If you know that you want God in your heart, and you do your best to serve him and follow him, and you're human, and you make mistakes, and you have a lousy week, but you pray to him, let it go and recognize and remember the communion is it's interesting is that one of my reading plans today happened to fall on Christ's crucifixion. And I love for myself when I plan a sermon like this, and then without realizing later on I have an affirmation of what I'm trying to portray in what my reading plan is. It blesses me. God has a way of blessing pastors, I should say, when we're presenting the word. It hits home for me as well. And so this is not me wagging my finger at you, it's me wagging my finger at myself as well. Is that our focus should be on God, and when our focus is on God, the rest of it falls into place. That leads me to my so what? It said, we do not need fear partaking of communion, but we should never take it flippantly. We should always give it reverence, because it is a celebration of our salvation Christ provided. So it is something to be happy about. It is something to be joyous about. It is something to be like, wow, Christ did that for me. Okay? But then when you read the passage and what the spear in his side and the nails in his hands and the crown of thorn and the mockery that he endured was for us. it's a celebration, but it's a very reverent celebration because of what he went through to give it to us. Okay? And so the point to ponder is, how do you prevent communion becoming routine? Because that's always the danger. Do we do it once a month? Do we do it randomly? Do we this? Do we that? Do we do it every Sunday? Some churches do it every Sunday. And it's all about, how do you keep it reverent and purposeful, and how do you not let it become routine? How do you let it not just be one of the things we do on Sunday, right? You have to find that balance. And so I personally have been the type who's like, I don't like scheduling it. But I also learned when I became a pastor, if I don't schedule it, it goes too long between having it. So we try to say that having it once a month, I can put it on the calendar, it reminds me, but again, we need to always make sure we're giving it the reverence that it needs. Okay, and then finalize memorizing Ephesians 1:13, and then continuing on the Matthew Beatitudes and beyond, read Matthew chapter 6. Okay? And with that, I'm going to ask the gentleman to come up for communion, to serve communion. And Susie's going to make her way up to play. And what I'd like to do is, for you to do as well, is to take this time as them handing out the elements to, just pray to God, pray to Jesus, let him know, just commune with him and build that relationship. Okay? I'll go ahead and pass out those. Starting in verse 23 of 1 Corinthians 11, it says, "For I, Paul, received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" And partake of the bread. In verse 25, it says, "In the same manner, he, Christ, also took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes.'" Randy, partake of the cup. For the sake of time, I think we'll skip to closing some.